around the corner. We're now joined by James Crepea. He, of course, is with the Oregonian. We've had James on before when it comes to realignment and much more, and just Oregon athletics. And then, James, we saw the tweet from earlier this week, and I contacted you about the streaming, and, you pretty much appeared to be very frustrated with it because of what other conferences are going to have when it comes to showing their games. Where are you today with all we've heard, seen, whatever is the truth when it comes to reporting?
Well, I mean, it seems like by the hour there's some other account and some other report out there in terms of who's involved in the Pac-12's next media negotiation. Even today, you had you had some of it. So until a deal is done, I think this is just going to kind of be part and parcel to it. But the idea that any conference would agree to a streaming only opportunity, if that were a thing, if that were reality, that would be bizarre to me. I don't understand how that would be palatable if that is indeed the direction that the Pac-12 goes, or any other conference for that matter. I don't know how any college conference could agree to such a proposal. So the report earlier in the week that Apple would be involved, in and of itself, that's not all that surprising. The idea that any streaming service would want an opportunity or seek an opportunity, and that if that opportunity were something they were going for, that they'd want exclusivity, that in and of itself really isn't that surprising. But it would be surprising if it were the best deal or only deal and only option available for the Pac-12 or anybody else. And ultimately, it would be even more surprising, regardless, if for Oregon specifically, that it was a deal that was acceptable, because I don't know how that would best serve really just about any institution at the FBS level, let alone Oregon. I don't know how it would best serve anybody to go to a streaming only capacity when it comes to visibility and trying to showcase your games and your institution.
James, do you feel like some of these news bites and decisions are even, which I believe that they'll get a deal done and everybody will be together for now, are not really going to set the Pac-12 up for the long term, no matter what they do here in the short term?
Well, ultimately, I think the inclination that the 10 remaining schools want to stay together and want to get a deal done, and that there isn't any one of them that's being resistant or holding up the process to try and do something else. I've been told that that's all real. That everybody would like to stick together, but you start to drill into the details of what exactly does that mean, though. Like, all right, yeah, that you'd like to, sounds great. I think in an ideal world, if you ask the 10 remaining schools, they would have loved to have stuck together as a 12-team league too. But ultimately that didn't really work out. So what exactly does the devil's in the details here. So when you get into, short term versus long term, and what exactly does some of this kind of shake out to mean? And even if they get a deal done for the short term, what does it ultimately mean? Again, what we don't know yet. We need more information. We need more details. Because the point is this is all sparked by the idea that from the report earlier in the week, and again, doesn't mean that that's wrong. Apple, if a formal offer from Apple TV may not have been presented just yet, and that could also be true. But ultimately, if that's the only thing, or it's the best thing, and that offer is for exclusivity, and there isn't something else, then I agree with you in that if that's what's there, that's why I say I don't understand how it would be palatable. I don't know how that could help anybody in the long run, because no matter what the money figure is, how do you actually enhance your visibility by going with a streaming only capacity? And that's why I say if it came to that, saying that there's a potential for that or an interest to that, I don't deny that at all. I would be surprised if a streaming service wouldn't want to be involved in various different discussions and want the exclusivity. But I would be surprised if the Pac-12 or any other conference at the college sports level would agree to it, because I'm with you. I don't know how it could help them in the long run. Forget the money aside. Like that's a short-term reward that ultimately I think robs you in the long run.
James, are you blown away they're at the point where they are, the conference right now?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. What is remotely surprising? Truly, and I mean that wholeheartedly. Why? I was the one, along with plenty of others. I'm hardly alone here, but I was the one who asked the OFCOV before the LA schools left if he had any concern about anyone leaving and being poached by another conference, and being told he was absolutely not concerned that happened. And within a month, they were gone.
Yep.
And then ever since then, there's ultimately it's the ticking clock at the end of the grant of rights and the end of the current deal. And then what happens? Well, what you know is there's 10 entities left. And what you know is, from a television market standpoint, fan base interest standpoint, general success, competitive success standpoint, why would it be surprising that there may not be a lot of suitors, or whatever suitors would be involved, that the offers may not be that lucrative, when in terms of television markets and television rating interest, what's left? If you take Oregon's games off the table and or Washington's games out of the equation, I mean, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the report from earlier in the week and the potential for this offer that Andrew Marchand of the New York Post talked about, but there's been plenty of other stuff written this week and previously.
Sure.
Whether it be from Dennis Dodd or Wilner or any number of other folks out there, examining what exactly is it that we're talking about. So when you say, am I surprised? No, I'm not surprised. What's left on the table? If you were buying the product, if you were one of these entities, ESPN, Fox, CBS, Apple, Amazon, or anybody else, or any other entity, or apparently Ion TV for about 3 seconds today. If you were anybody, what are you buying? You mean to tell me that there isn't a long list of? You mean to tell me, David, that you weren't offering tens of millions of dollars to watch Cal and Washington State football? No. I mean, come on now.
Yeah,
you knocked me over with a feather.
No,
you weren't offering that yourself?
Yeah, you're right. I just, because you're more right in the middle of it. We've tried to cover the hell out of this, and honestly, it's kind of like watching something just die. It really is. And the Big 12 has been through theirs where they've had, oh my God, what are we going to do? And they found a way to survive and move on, and seem to be, in a way, almost flourishing, and maybe even growing. And so is this on Kliavkoff, or is this on Larry Scott, or is it on both?
Yes.
Okay.
It all the above. Look, George came into a bad deal. He came into a bad situation. And for that matter, wind the clock back. And history's not going to treat Larry Scott very well. But ultimately, there were a lot of things that he did early in his tenure, and attempts that he made early in his tenure, that would have put the Pac-12 in a better situation, because he was the one who was coming to the table the last go-around of all this with realignment. Remember, talking about trying to add Texas and Oklahoma State and et cetera to the Pac-12. Obviously, it didn't work. Didn't happen, but it would have been a very different world had it did, if it did. Well, he brought that to the table. And all right, launched the Pac-12 network at the time, which at the time, at the immediacy in the reaction of that moment, it wasn't, what are you doing as a conference getting into a network, and you mean you're not partnered with a ESPN or a Fox and not leveraging it, you're not going to get distribution. All the criticisms of today, at the time, in real time, that was met with, wow, what a deal for the Pac-12, and how good a deal that is, and how advanced they're going to be, and how much further along they're going to be compared to where they were, and everything at the time. Well, again, all of it in retrospect doesn't really stand up so well. So he deserves plenty of criticism for lots of those things. some of which at the time were not criticized at all, some of which at the time, frankly, there weren't a lot of better deals to be had then. But Kliavkoff comes into a bad situation. And as I say, he got, as you point out, got outmaneuvered by another conference commission, another peer, and Brett Yormark, who wasn't exactly in the job for very long, and whose league was in a perilous situation, and whose grant of rights was going for a year longer, but got outmaneuvered by him in getting to the marketplace and finding a deal and getting a deal done to create stability for the short term and long term and lock in television slots accordingly. Okay. Larry Scott didn't do that. Now, they were all in the play the long game strategy. But once things changed, Larry Scott was gone. George got outmaneuvered there. George got outmaneuvered by Kevin Warren and getting into, after the Texas and Oklahoma move, and aligning in the so-called alliance with Warren and Jim Phillips, and got played like a fiddle. Nobody, in a gentleman's agreement that preposterous exercise was. Larry had nothing to do with that. So for as bad a deal as it walked into, and for as confining as it was, and restrictive as it was, and difficult as it was to try to make adjustments in the near term, playing the long game, Larry deserves criticism for that. The Pac-12 presidents and chancellors ultimately deserve a lot of criticism for that, both the whole Larry Scott tenure and then buying into the exercise of playing the long game. And they deserve the criticism, and as does George, for getting played for the last 2 years and now find themselves in this position where there may not be particularly attractive options on the table. And now it creates this angst. And whether any of it, by the way, is real or it's just a battle of perception out there publicly, because as it takes longer and longer to get a deal done, and until it does, these are the things that get out there. And like I say, including today with, there's this entity that none of y'all have ever heard of who's going to get involved. And then within hours, no, they're not. This is what you create. This is the environment that you've brought on your own selves. You have no one to blame but yourself in this one. You got outmaneuvered. You are hanging in the wind. And, yeah, you may not have a whole lot of attractive options. Well, like I say, whose fault is that?
So what's Oregon's future? Honestly, what are listen, obviously they would love for the Big Ten to call them. And you're right in the middle of that. Whether that ever happens or has happened, I don't know. If, in fact, the numbers for whatever the Pac-12 get is in the 20 range, somewhere in the lower or mid-20s, does Oregon, Washington, do they basically lock arms and say, we're not doing that? Or what can they – I'm talking to Oregon right now. What can they do?
It's a great question, David, and ultimately it comes down to, look, if we're talking in the 20s of millions per year per school, if that's whatever the offer is that the Pac-12 is bringing to the table, whatever that involves, I don't care who's broadcasting it. If that's the number, if you're Oregon, I'm not kidding. I'm not speaking for them in terms of like a representative or a fan or whatever. I'm just doing the job and covering the institution.
Sure.
But I can read the landscape insofar as I know what the money is for every other league based on the reports that are out there. And you're the most valuable commodity out there. So you can change the name of Oregon to anybody. It doesn't matter. And anything in a marketplace like this, you have to explore every option then. You have to be open to joining another league or quite literally going independent if it came to that. Because at that, you can't sit there in that position, in that negotiating position. I don't care what school we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
If you are the most valuable commodity left and you are stuck potentially having to accept significantly less than market value for what you are bringing to the table, and you're already at a competitive disadvantage relative to many peers, and now you're going to be potentially even further, the idea that you just have to accept that because of your some kind of misguided unity with other institutions who are dragging you down in that negotiation. No, I think you have to explore every option. So what does that mean? Where do they go? I don't know. I don't know if that becomes you look for a life preserver from the Big 12. I don't know if that means, obviously, as you point out, yeah, many in this fan base have started to, if we weren't necessarily warm from the beginning, some were immediately like, get to the Big Ten, get to the Big Ten. Now I think almost everybody's like, yeah, let's go. Let's see over. But the Big Ten's all about equal distribution.
Yeah.
Can you get them to agree to say, hey, we want to join you, and we'll take 30 cents on the dollar because it's more than what we're getting out here. 40 cents a dollar, anything. I don't know because the Big Ten's been all about equal distribution since the dawn of time. So can you actually get an invite to that league that is currently sitting at 16? Can you get them to go beyond that and agree to giving you less, not because, giving you less sounds like it's intolerable, but because they're all about equal distribution. And if you don't make them more money in adding you, they're not going to be particularly interested in doing so. I don't know. I don't know if that door is open.
James Crepea, the Oregonian, with us on 365 Sports, and some of in the chat room. You can see that and hear the truth bombs from James, the frustration as well from covering a team, seeing how this thing has just been like dismantled in so many ways, and maybe there's a Hail Mary. I don't know, Paul.
James, do you think that the Pac-12? I mean, the ACC is probably going through this a little bit too. Granted, they're locked into a much longer grant of rights, but there are, if you look at the new Big 12, everybody's kind of in the same spot, as far as, where they want to be, what their institution is, like what their growth potential is. The SEC, Big Ten, kind of same things, regardless of wins on the field. But the Pac-12 and ACC in particular kind of have a bunch of different schools who have a bunch of different personalities. And that's probably not easy to deal with, especially when you're trying to think about long-term and what is best for everyone.
I don't know if I totally agree with that assessment. I don't know if I totally get there because, for one, like, who in the ACC are you putting in they're wildly different by way of how they are as a group. I understand there's big schools, small schools. If you want to tell me there's some schools who are less competitive in football at the moment, but who exactly or you're identifying there, or same thing even for the Pac-12 for that matter, in some capacity. Because, for instance, like you say, like, all right, hey, the Big 12's on very sound footing now, absolutely, and should feel accordingly about that. But if we round the clock back to when Texas and Oklahoma left, like, let's not kid ourselves and act like if Kansas got an invitation to the Big Ten that it wouldn't have taken it. And they frankly fit in a lot of ways, other than you want to tell me about, Kansas football doesn't bring a lot to the table. Yeah, but in terms of they're an AAU school, basically in the geographic footprint and other things, and are also obviously pretty good in basketball. So I can say I'm not entirely sure that I agree with you there. Obviously, the Big 12 ain't losing anybody anytime soon. They're locked into a very nice deal for the next several years. But in terms of the ACC's in a tough spot, other than its grant of rights, yeah, you're right. You point that out. Well, their athletic director was at a hearing today to their board of trustees, laying out some of those very details, apparently, as I followed Twitter today.
Yeah.
Being out, he's quoted as saying, hey, if Florida State's going to be competitive, certain things are going to have to change because of this media deal and whatnot, which is why I've said also since the LA schools were officially leaving that, to me, outside of a overture from the Big Ten, whether it be for Oregon, Washington, or anyone else, that if we're talking about the league long-term sustainability, that the Pac-12 and ACC should be in greater discussions, because academically, outside of some extremes, and there are a few, don't get me wrong, but that academically there is a lot more on level playing ground for many members of the Pac-12 with many members of the ACC, again, other than some extremes in there that would probably have some issue, than there is with many members of the Pac-12 and many members of the Big 12 from an academic standpoint, for those who care about such things. And in the Pac-12, there are some who really, really care about that, for instance. But could you actually get those two leagues to combine, and what does that look like? And I don't know all to the nth degree by way of the ACC's grant of rights other than the term that we know about, could they actually add 2, 4, 6, 8 different members of the Pac-12 and make some humongous coast-to-coast conference? And does that make any sense to do? I can't speak to whether or not that would even be viable in any capacity to Jim Phillips or anybody else in the ACC. But I do think that because of, as you point out, there are some members there that are looking for more and are looking for greater stability, other than the fact that they've got this massive grant of rights for a long period of time. How do you enhance that? Again, if you're not, ultimately, guys, let's get to the bottom line here. As we all know, and we talked about this, I think, one of the last times I was on.
Yep, I know what you're saying.
Whether we were talking about the ACC, Pac-12, or Big 12, everybody's got a problem. Whether we got a grant of rights for the next 10 years, 8 years, for 30 million, 40 million, God bless. You know who you're not? You're not the SEC and you're not the Big 10. And unless you're in one of those two pools, everybody else has got some area to gripe or be concerned about. And further consolidation is going to happen in college sports, not only because I believe it's going to happen, because I've been told that by people far and wide all over the country, including people here in Oregon. So it was recently as last week. So if people inside the business and inside the institutions believe further consolidation is going to happen, if you're already of that belief, then why would you agree to continue to stand in an entity that you don't believe in the long run is going to continue to exist, whether we're talking about 10 years from now, 20 years from now, whatever the case is? Everybody thinks we're headed to super conferences. Whether that's 2 or whether that's 3, I don't know. But if that's where we're headed, well, then anybody else in all these other discussions of, oh, well, they could jump over here, the corner schools could go here, we could all play the NCAA video game from 10 years ago and bump around properties. But ultimately, if you're not part of the Big 2, everybody's got an issue in some way, shape, or form.
Well, James, thanks for your time. Knew you would come straight with us. You always have, and saw a little bit of that from your tweet earlier this week. Who knows? God knows. Tomorrow might be something different in the end, hopefully for everybody. Again, I don't think anyone in college football wants to be the guy or whoever maybe crush the souls of different programs. But right now it's a dog eat dog and everyone for themselves. And that includes what Oregon's trying to do or Washington's trying to do or anyone else is trying to do. Appreciate your time. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you. James Crepea, the Oregonian. You can hear it. And James is true.